Hello, everybody. This is a lively group today. That's great. I want to introduce our speaker today, who's a very special person. For those of you I don't know, I'm Susan McDaniel. I'm director of the Institute for the Family and the chief psychologist. Yesterday and today we have a visiting professor, Froma Walsh from University of Chicago, who's a longtime colleague and friend of mine. So we're very honored to have her here. Dr. Walsh is a clinical psychologist. She's Firestone Professor Emerita in the Crown School and Department of Psychiatry, University of Chicago. I'm getting some feedback. Yeah, thank you. And is co-founder and co-director of the Chicago Center for Family Health. Dr. Walsh is the leading clinical scholar on family resilience. Her research-informed family resilience framework is applied worldwide. And I want to mention that very early in my career, when I met Lyman Wynn, who's one of the pioneering family therapists in the world and was a chair of this department, I talked to Lyman, and he was very excited about Froma's work. And Lyman's research was on families of patients with schizophrenia, and he was very excited that someone was studying normal family processes. So that's how I first got to know Froma. With over 3 decades of experience and expertise with profound loss situations and complicated bereavement, her resilience-oriented systemic practice approach integrates developmental, relational, social, and cultural spiritual perspectives. Dr. Walsh received her BA with honors in psychology at Berkeley. She got her MSW at Smith College and her PhD in human development and behavioral sciences at the University of Chicago. She's past president of the American Family Therapy Academy, and I was on the board when she was president. That was an honor and very interesting. She's the past editor of the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy and the recipient of many awards for her distinguished contributions to mental health from the American Psychological Association, the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and the American Family Therapy Academy. Over 120 scholarly publications. Her recent books are Strengthening Family Resilience, which is a 3rd edition, and her book last year, which is terrific and very important, called Complex and Traumatic Loss, Fostering Healing and Resilience, not fostering resistance, sorry, fostering resilience. So thank you for being here and looking forward to hearing your talk, Froma.
Thank you so much, and it's really a joy to be back here in Rochester because I've been involved in various ways with the Family Center during the Lyman Wynn years on the board, and all the tremendous work that you're doing here, Susan, with your faculty and in the training. It's a short time to cover a lot of material, and loss has been something close to my heart. Many of us come with a calling into our professions, and we don't realize that we were called here, but we start to see that we're drawn toward certain specializations or away from others, or that there are things in our own lives that we need to work out. And Susan mentioned I was drawn into normal family processes because I was in a schizophrenia research program myself as the family studies coordinator, and I had a so-called normal control group. And it kind of shattered common assumptions about normal families as they were in mid-20th century. And I started to realize how diverse families are, and that there's no such thing as stress-free families, that every family is going through one thing or another, and that what seemed to matter in their upbringing, in their own lives, in thriving in life, was the way they handled adversity. So things happen in our lives, but it's what we do, both to prepare when we can and to respond when things happen beyond our control or out of expectations. And so I was drawn to the work on resilience in human systems. And as it moved from looking at traits in children that survived many traumatic experiences to adult life. And I wanted to apply that to look at families, look at relational systems, look at couples, and what happens and how do they handle those experiences, and then applying it to situations of complicated grief and loss. So that really has been my specialty over the years. Yet, even though I've been doing this for many decades and I've written books and journal articles, professional work, and I've taught courses on loss, it seems today still that we don't have much training in whether it's medical or psychiatric, psychology, social work, that really focuses on death and loss. And I think this is Irving Yalom was a distinguished scholar and trainer in group therapy. And he wrote about how facing death is like staring into the sun. We can glance, but we quickly look away. Why is that? Because it's a shared human experience. We all must face our own mortality, and we all are going to lose loved ones, people that are important to us over the course of our life. And maybe in our own childhoods, we have, or our families have suffered really significant or unbearable losses. So we'll look at that today. I hope to get through time, that we have some time for questions and discussion. But what I want to focus on is how we can best help bereaved individuals and their families to grieve and adapt to complicated losses, to navigate the challenges ahead, and to go forward to thrive. In the mental health field, the focus has been on individual and diagnosis and treatment of grief symptoms, and the diagnosis that was developed over the last decade and is now in the nomenclature of prolonged grief disorder in the DSM and also international system, which is symptom focused. It's manualized treatment, psychotropic medication, and it can pathologize normal, varied grief responses because it's also acontextual. It doesn't consider the larger circumstances. We talk now about the lived experience of facing death, of an unexpected death, of a traumatic loss, and who was there to be helpful. How is the family coping? What are the larger challenges that have been presented by this death? And what I've developed over these 3 decades is a resilience-oriented systemic approach. My early work with Monica McGoldrick, those of you who are familiar with genograms know her important work in that area. When we began in our work, we were at Yale in Department of Psychiatry in our training, and both of us had experienced a loss, or were going through that. My mother had a chronic illness that no one in the family said to me was terminal, but of course she died. And Monica had just had the death in a tragic accident to her boyfriend. And somehow we came together, started talking, and maybe those experiences heightened our awareness to grief and loss, so that when we were working clinically, we would notice that there were grief issues that had been unattended, maybe suppressed, that were sometimes coming out in other symptoms: separation problems in the family, headaches, nightmares, alcohol misuse, affairs, and maybe striving for success and undoing it each time. And when we asked more to try to understand more the clients that we were working with, the patients, often they would say that there was a tragic loss. And that when we asked, first of all, about that death and loss, secondly, what we found was no one ever talked about it. It just went underground. No one ever helped them with it. And it now was surfacing in other ways. A couple came in. They were concerned about fighting, really, over whether to have a second child. And we were observing through a one-way mirror. And there was a Gianfranco Cecchine, who was a stellar European family therapist, was visiting and watching with us. And I happened to have a little sketch of a genogram in front of me as I was watching as a supervisor. And they were fighting, and the therapy was focused on what are your plans, your how is this going to affect your life? What are your feelings about this? And I noticed that the husband's mother had died in childbirth with his younger sibling. So we asked about that, and immediately he said, I never really connected it here. I mean, you would think, but it just went underground. It was so painful, so overwhelming to him that he grew up with defenses throughout his life. And now this argument over having the second child, he said it wasn't about the baby. I was terrified I would lose my wife the same way I lost my mother. So these are issues that we found can come to the fore later if therapists and loved ones and families are not helping, providing support for healing, for grieving, and for going on to thrive. So a resilience-oriented systemic approach expands the focus beyond symptoms to attend to the influences in family and social context, to facilitate healing and positive adaptation. And we call it family therapy. That's where these systemic approaches develop. But we may work with individuals. We want, in our conceptual understanding, to know what has helped, what hinders in their grieving, in their adaptation. What is it about the death situation that they are ruminating, that they can't get over? And the misunderstandings that people have about marching through these phases of grief. So we may work with an individual, we may coach them, we may bring in a partner, we may have a family session, we may have sibling sessions. We work also now with community-wide disasters, and we may have larger community forums. What we want to do is to see that in a resilience-oriented approach, we don't do it alone. There's a South African saying, grieving alone, it corrodes the body and the spirit. Grieving together breathes new life. And that's really true, that we need each other and depend on each other in order to survive and to thrive. So I like this image of grief as a tangled ball of emotion. And it's all of those things. And as we see, a systemic view is multi-level. So it's everything from the neurophysiological. Sometimes patients will come later with somatic complaints, or a child will be having nightmares because there was a death in the family. And wider kinship networks. I think family today means many different things. I want to ask about that, but to be careful about stereotypes, it isn't only who's in the household, it's who are the important kin in your network. And they might not be, they may be best friends. As we age, friends become the most important kin. And what are the social, the economic, the community influences? And can we also draw on cultural, spiritual influences to foster that healing? I like this saying as well, grief is in two parts. The first is loss, and the second is the remaking of life. So let me just very fast go through what I consider research-informed practice over the past 2-3 decades now that dispels some myths about so-called normal grief. It's really quite diverse. There are many varied pathways, which is why to call something prolonged grief disorder, it means, well, it's longer than in our culture we expect it to be in some definition of just not too much and not too little. When really there's quite a difference across cultures, within families, across generations, and for children at different ages. So what that also means is that within families, they're not going to be at the same place at the same time. So when I'm working with an individual who's bereaved, I want to know, how has it affected everyone in the family? How is this one doing? That one? How do you try to help one another? Also, there is an oscillation of grief. So there's no predictable timetable, because even though we know that, many people who come to us for help, it's in the drinking water that people think they should be going through a progressive stage. And well, what happened? It's 2 years later and it's the anniversary, or I see the other children graduating and my son is not here to graduate with them. There's another baby being born and something stirred up in me. Later life, you still remember, and sometimes with resurgent pain, the death of a child, because you don't get over it. You grieve through it, and it's adapting, not resolving. And finally, the idea of detaching from the deceased person, which was prominent in psychoanalytic theory. The research shows that really in healthy grieving, it's about continuing bonds by transforming the attachments. That people die, but relationships don't. If it's been an important and a positive relationship, you sustain it through spiritual connections, memories, stories, deeds, and legacies. And that this is over time, that you carry those relationships forward. You remember, honoring, and trying to go forward in other relationships and other things you do in your life. And yet, many people come to us that have suffered abuse, or they're alienated, extreme conflict in their families, and after the death, it's still reverberating and ruminating because they carry that with them over time. Now, much of the work I do is in that situation, and there are ways that we can work with that in therapy, but I also encourage you right after the loss or as a loss is approaching, the work that we do then is really preventive of the longer term risks and challenges. So from a systemic perspective in families, a loss affects all members, all bonds, and their family functioning. Everything has changed. And a cascade of stressors will compound the distress. If you think of the death of a child, it's a parental grief, but there's also a grandparent, maybe a primary grandparent who is grieving. It affects the spousal relationship. When a spouse dies, you may have to be helping your children with it while you're also grieving the life of your partner. So it is complicated, and it has both immediate and long-term complications. But in a systems approach, these influences are recursive because how a family approaches an impending death or a probable terminal illness and how it responds in the wake of loss can make all the difference for malfunctioning or for positive functioning for every member, for their bonds, and for the family unit, which is why we pay attention to the family. And I'm doing more work in recent years. My daughter is in international humanitarian relief work with an NGO, and of course in every place in our world right now is really quite troubled, and it can be overwhelming. And yet they persist in their work because every life that can be saved, every family that's bereaved can be helped, And that's what our work is about. When we can't maybe stop overwhelming loss and suffering, what can we do? And that can make a difference for somebody. So sharing grief and encouraging collaborative recovery efforts is very important. Well, I'll read this later if we have time. I want to give an example here. It's a mother who comes to a child psychiatry clinic, outpatient clinic, referred by the school because her daughter has been failing in her grades over recent weeks and is inattentive, just seems not present emotionally, mentally. And so the mother brings her in and is sitting in the waiting room, and the daughter is seen. The mother's asked a few questions. The mother says, I don't know. She won't talk to me. She doesn't say anything. Talk to her. The daughter doesn't really give much of any information. And so the resident asks me, consults with me, and I said, well, what else has been going on in the family? And in the next session, what he finds out is that the oldest son in the family was shot and killed 16 weeks earlier in gang fighting in the neighborhood. It was heartbreaking, obviously the oldest son in the family. And each family member reacted in a different way. The father withdrew and started heavily drinking. He was a bit of a drinker, but that's where he turned to cope, was to his drinking, withdrew in his anguish. The next youngest son went out into the streets to seek revenge, to find out who did it, to that cycle of harm and retaliation that is so hard to break. And the next son in the family, mother said, oh, he's as good as gold. You don't need for him to come in because he's my helper. And that little boy was suffering inside and holding it in to be strong for his mother. She was alone in her grief, and so she focused on the daughter and the daughter's school problems. So that's how in a family we need to ask about every member. And there were just a brief, maybe 8 sessions of work with the family together to help them come together, to help the parents come together, a couple session to help them support each other and to help them together help their children with the grief and loss. So losses are multifaceted in families, the loss of a significant person, a loved one. But did I already say this? No. Multiple unique bonds. So I've mentioned that. The death of a breadwinner or a caregiver, primary caregiver, is disruptive to all of family functioning. And how do we help them identify what their needs are to recalibrate, to go forward? The death of an only child is a tragedy. In an intact family, I've heard families say it's like a hole in the heart of the family. I had a video of one family sitting around the dinner table. They ordinarily took hands and said grace. And now this little boy is sitting there. He doesn't know what to do with his hand. I just, every day, the absence of the loved one is felt. In that family, the father couldn't work he was a piano tuner for many months. And the youngest son had been closest to the oldest brother, was like a second father, and he was turning on the gas to set a fire. He was going out into the streets, hoping he would be struck and he could join his brother in heaven. So intervening early on to help families with grief and loss can make all the difference. In a community disaster we're seeing now with climate change and more intense flooding and fires, that whole communities are upended, and that there may be the loss of loved ones, the loss of a pet. And some people, it's like, well, how can you be concerned about your pet when we're dealing with all of this? So there can be sometimes a trivializing, a minimizing. But what I've seen in stories that interview community members, what really helps the most is this sense of we value our connections, we value our community, we want to pull together, we want to rebuild, and that keeps them going as much as maybe there are individuals who have suffered more deeply, have more intensive mental health needs, and can benefit from individuals. So it's not an either or. Sometimes having the family session or having the group sessions, as we've done with refugee families in Chicago, that you can identify a family member who may need more intensive work. But having those family forums, they start to see how they draw strength from each other, that others have been like them. I'm not going crazy, it's not just me. And we've all been through this, and they can help each other through different strategies and through, for some, it's emotional support. Some aren't good at emotional, maybe they're good at practical support. But it is that not grieving alone, but together. I think one part that gets missed sometimes is the loss of hopes and dreams, especially for a young couple when a spouse dies. Their whole life was ahead, everything that they had wanted together, and that maybe their extended family too. And when a child dies, it's usually the most tragic loss that's experienced. Everything that was hoped for. One family that I worked with, it would have been the first son of the first son of the first son in a Greek Orthodox family. The whole family, since the day of the wedding, was waiting for this son to be born, and it was a stillbirth. And the couple came to me, and the father said, I don't know why we're here. You can't bring back my son. And you feel a little bit helpless. We have training to do things to help people. And no, this is not a problem I can solve. But maybe we can talk about this and meeting together, because the couple sat at two ends of the sofa because she found it helpful. I always ask, are your spiritual connections or your cultural connections helpful to you? And she said, yes, for me, I go every day. And in the congregation, our priest is very helpful. And the father was furious, and he pounded his fist and he said, I can't go back. I'm too angry at God. It's too unjust to take the life of my son. He didn't have a chance at life. I am angry at God. And those are situations where I can ask the questions and to hear that there is a spiritual crisis here, and that might be a place for a chaplain, a hospital chaplain, to come in and to help with that spiritual crisis. Finally, I want to mention the shattered assumptions of normality, predictability, security, trust. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is something when we are in a world that we are brought up and expect to be somewhat predictable, and those predictions are shattered, especially an early death. The sense of security, if you've lost a parent, who will be there for me now? Who will care for me? A worry that you could lose the other parent too. A sense of trust. This was a violent act. How can I trust? Who can I trust? Maybe only my own, and can I even trust them? So we also need to attend to social disparities in the risk and impact and bereavement itself, with racial and ethnic differences, social class, and marginalized groups. Particularly with mortality deaths, we know now that maternal deaths for Black and Native American women are at least twice as high, and in some cases 3 times as high as for white women. And, many factors feed into that, but it means that their grief is going to be complicated in the family, with the anger, with the sense of being abandoned, of being having nowhere to turn, or the lack of resources. For other families, they may lose their housing with a loss of income with a death, or the medical bills that are just overwhelming and take all the savings. And so there are things that make the adaptation, the grief complicated and the adaptation more complicated. So it may be in the health conditions, the prevention and treatment increases risk, their access to care and resources, and also the neighborhood that may pose more risk, more crowded conditions, and we certainly saw this in COVID, and environmental risks of chemical pollution, and we know all of that. But it breeds a sense of injustice that can also complicate grief. So what is resilience? And I want to just kind of speak about some myths that we need to dispel. It's about coping, adaptation, and positive growth. There's now over 3 decades of research on child and adolescent resilience, adult resilience, aging resilience, and now it's multi-level, looking at the family, looking at how schools promote resilience or not, community, and larger systems. But it's about more than surviving, regaining that ability to thrive, and through the process of grieving, of struggling with it, having to access, maybe tap into strengths that you didn't know you had or didn't use, reach out to others in ways that you might have felt, I should be able to manage this, or I don't depend on others, it's shameful, I shouldn't need their help. But you tap into your own internal resources and you reach out to others, and maybe you find that others are there for you and that you had strengths you didn't even know. The myth of the rugged individual persists, and resilience has been so much a buzzword now. You'll hear it in sports news in the evening about a team or a player who overcame injury and went on to score, and, as if this is something that, you just bounce back and, everybody, and you want to be resilient. And people say, well, just be resilient. This is hard. You can get through it. And that's not helpful. And first of all, human resilience is nurtured in relational bonds, as I've said. It involves dynamic, multi-level systemic processes. And we can build resilience so that when something happens, we're not going to get over it right away. It's not just some people are resilient and others aren't. Some families are resilient and others aren't. Some may be more vulnerable, and it may be largely either they're facing a really critical illness or disability or a genetic condition that poses higher risk. It may be that they have fewer resources. So be careful, because people then say, well, you should just be more resilient. That the capacities can be built, but no one is going to be the ideal family, but everybody in my practice over the years, we can help them to gain resilience in dealing with the adversity that they face. Another myth is this: just bounce back, put it behind you, move on. And a lot of people will just say, be grateful for what you have. At least you have another child. You're young, you can marry again. Those can be felt as very painful and disqualifying of the real profound grief that someone has at a death and loss. So we have to be very careful, because people are going to hear that around them, because everybody wants them to feel better. That squeeze a little bit of that happiness, just a smiley face and cheerful, or God never gives you more than you can handle. And that's very common, and it's meant to be helpful, but it may be felt as, that doesn't mean that I don't grieve deeply. So the other thing is, there's going to be suffering, struggle, and setbacks. You can't just go back to normal. You need to adapt, construct a new normal. And so forget new normal, because we're in and I hate the term too, uncharted territory, or this is it's what is it? Shocking but not surprising, because we're living in a period of uncertainty where it's hard to say, and we have to kind of grapple with a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of bad news that is coming into us every day, and find a way to deal with that and not become despondent and despairing, because that robs active agency. You don't feel like there's anything you can do because there's just too much. So resilience involves struggling well, working through and learning and growing stronger from the experience, reorienting a future vision, and integrating the losses of resilient passage into the chapters of life. So my work has been at the family level. There's a crisis, but there's also going to be these disruptive challenges over time with multi-stress conditions. And how do we mobilize social, community, cultural, and spiritual support? I want to talk just briefly about complex loss situation. I mean, this could be all day to talk about this, but I just want to bring it to the foreground, because sometimes it seems like, well, these are just too traumatic or too complicated, and we only have limited time, a short contact. Maybe we'll just refer. And maybe that's needed. But with a sudden untimely death, as I've mentioned, particularly one that feels like this is, your parents should die before your children, and that there's something really unjust about that. Ambiguous loss with dementias or other progressive cognitive disorders, where it's gradual and it's painful and you're experiencing the loss over time. In missing or abducted family members, and we're seeing that particularly in war, or where you don't know, is someone still alive or are they dead? Will they be coming back or not? Pauline Boss's work is really fundamental there on helping people to live with that ambiguity, maybe to hold out hope that's reasonable, and yet to also be able to live with the uncertainty, and to realize in families they may need help because some are ready to move on. He's not coming back, you need to go forward. No, I don't want to give up hope. And that can lead to alienation or conflict in the family. I mentioned disenfranchised loss, where it's either unacknowledged or trivialized, and that's very common with pregnancy-related deaths, perinatal deaths, where there's this sense, well, you can have another child, or really pushing to move forward. And stigmatized losses, particularly with suicide, with drug-related deaths, overdose, that you just don't talk about it. People disappear. It's hard for families to get support in the wake, in the aftermath. They're more likely to be to cover it over, maybe not to talk to anybody, to feel like they're looked down upon or they're blamed for their loved one's death. A spiritual crisis, I mentioned the injustice, a sin and punishment, a husband who, when I'm seeing a couple after fertility treatments, it didn't work. Well, I meet with each partner individually and just ask a little bit more about how they make sense or understand what goes through their heads about this. And he says, I really think this is God's punishment. I was unfaithful to my wife, and that's why we couldn't have a child. He hasn't communicated this to her, but it's very important in their conversation. Another situation, a woman was sent to me by her mother-in-law. They had a 4-year-old son. The second child was stillborn, daughter. And the mother was grieving now many, many months, taking the 4-year-old to the grave almost daily. And the mother-in-law called and said, you've got to help her. This isn't good for our grandson, and she really needs help. And so just in talking with her and understanding how she made meaning of what happened, she said, well, I'm not religious, but I was raised very Christian religious, and I really believe this was God's punishment because I didn't baptize my son. So people carry these beliefs that can be painful as well as the death itself. And so we need to understand their meaning making around how things happen. And then when sometimes death is senseless, it was caught in the crossfire, something dropped from a construction site, was killed when a truck came across the highway and hit the car head on. How do you find meaning in going forward? How do you make meaning out of your journey ahead? Complicated family dynamics, I won't get into today, and past trauma and loss. What we see, and I mentioned it earlier, sometimes it will go, and I'll just, let me see where I am. This was Jason, who made a suicide attempt at 14. He had had when the family, they met with the family at the beginning and asked who's in the family, they only mentioned that he had a 12-year-old sister. There was no mention made that there had been an older brother who died at 14 in a car crash where his friend was driving. And it was only Jason who mentioned his brother. And the therapist was a little confused and looked back again and say more about that. Well, he then told the story, and he said, and the question was, well, how did the family handle that? How helpful were your parents? They were so overwhelmed that I tried to make up for their loss. I dressed like him. I wore all of his hand-me-down clothes. I tried to be everything they wanted for him. And then I got to 14 and I didn't know how to be anymore. So I thought I would join him. How could I go on and live my life when his life was lost? So this idea of the replacement child is something we look for as well. So we'll really run out of time very soon, but I think increasingly we're seeing a tragic accident, murders, in gun violence, particularly in some neighborhoods. The rise in suicide in recent years. Gun violence is now the leading death cause for children from 10 to, I believe, 14. I don't have the numbers here. And the second leading cause from 10 to 21. It's just pervasive. And families, again, don't get the help they need. They just try to soldier on, try to cope with their lives. Other kids that survive may need some help as well. I mentioned suicide. The high rate for gender and sexual orientation variant youth is something that we need much more attention to, and issues of bullying in schools and helping families with acceptance. We do know that regardless of what the major stressors were, if they were peer stressors or family, but when families are able to accept and to affirm their youth, those children have the decrease in risk of suicide is dramatic. And with drug-related death, often families are blamed. How could you not have made a difference? And sometimes families will feel guilty relief if this is a problem with addiction that has gone on a long time, and they've faced many times of almost losing a child. So there are common challenges in shattered assumptions, in violent death circumstances, in anger, a sense of injustice when there's been murder or a tragic accident, in the now with the fentanyl crisis, kids who just try drugs and their death isn't like is a long-term process. There can be blame, shame, and guilt. What the recriminations, what should I have done? What should we have done? It might be, why not me? Why was it him? Or if they've dealt, as I mentioned, say, with a crisis over a very long period of time, when there's a sense of relief, we knew this was coming all along, and then feeling guilty about that. Persisting ambiguity with suicide and sometimes with violent deaths. Why? How did it happen? We may never know. We can't know for sure. And the disenfranchised loss, again, with social judgment and stigma. We'll be called upon more, and I won't go into it now because I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions and comments. The global pandemic. And this is something I want us to pay more attention to because I've already talked about disasters in communities, other situations, but I want to just take a moment to look at global pandemic. This is what we've been coming through. And you may remember that period of isolation. And then this sense of time just evaporating. I can't, when somebody asks me how long ago something happened, I have to go +3 because somehow I lost that time in my normal life. And it also leaves all of us as professionals kind of exhausted because in psychiatric clinics, I know in Chicago, a long waiting list. There aren't enough therapists to see all the people, particularly youth, with rising depression and anxiety, other somatic things that are long-term reverberations of everything we've been through, but also of the uncertainty that lies ahead. Hit the wrong one. There we go. So I want to say and I think you've received my article. Is that going to go out to everybody here? So how it's more than just the death and loss, but we need to attend to those who lost a beloved family member and weren't able to do their rituals, their community gatherings, and their burials or their cremations in the ways that we know across cultures support healthy grieving. And it may get suppressed after the pandemic. I just got COVID like 3 or 4 weeks ago, right? It's over. Nobody wears masks. I was very careful still because I'm old. I still got COVID. My close friend just lost her husband to COVID and died. But there is this sense of everybody wants to move on after COVID. And so there may not be the support that families need when a loved one dies. And they may suppress it, and it may come out, as I've said earlier, in other symptoms that bring them to therapy later. And so we should watch for that because they may not have been able to process their grief. Okay, I think, I love this about cultural resources because the love never dies. In Chicago, in the Pilsen neighborhood, the Latino community, the Day of the Dead was enormously healing for those who lost loved ones. And extended family is close. And she had lost several loved ones in the COVID pandemic. Having these home altars and the rituals were really helpful in healing. And so we need to ask about how do you find that your culture or your faith is helpful to you. I've developed a framework that's useful, and we won't have time in this short time to go into it. But again, I want to emphasize the meaning making and how some people can come out of the worst of times and find that their values enlarge, their connections enlarge through meaning and purpose, a spiritual nourishment, a sense of faith, might be through their community, through nature or other forms. It inspires new possibilities, and they reappraise and commit to what really matters. So this is the transformation that often can happen, and that we can be part of that, not immediately, but over the months as they move forward. They often find increased compassion that leads them to social action, that's going to benefit others and lead to prevention. And the continuing bonds that we perpetuate so that death not just ends a life, but that we can continue that relationship on. I guess we need to be fully present when we're working with death and loss to provide a safe haven. It's not a problem to solve. We can't fix it. But we can be at their side, offer compassionate listening, honoring their experience, their deep connection, humanize and contextualize their grief and distress, and through appreciative inquiry, explore their meanings and implications. Caution, our role is not to provide meaning. Viktor Frankl warned us about that, but to facilitate their meaning-making and integration over time, and to facilitate their active agency, compassion, and encouraging them to strengthen and move forward. And the pathways in healing and resilience are going to be long and varied. They're going to be rocky and rolling, maybe. And the anguish and overwhelm are important. And that our compassion and our vulnerability are human. So we must, for our effectiveness, take care of ourselves and to encourage in our work system ways that we can support each other when we have a patient who dies or a family bereavement, that we're not on our own to handle our own grief at the loss of people that we've come to care about. So revitalizing through all the different ways that are helpful to think about that. And finally, I love this slide, that this is where you are at death and loss, the past and the future.
I have a question, and then hopefully we'll have time for perhaps one or two others. Thank you very much, Froma. That was terrific. You talked a lot about the problems of our patients and our families dealing with COVID and the pandemic. But I'd like to ask you about us, because health professionals, whether mental health or larger health professionals, have been often traumatized by the experience, their own lives and lives of their families threatened, reorganizing all the services in the hospital to accommodate people being isolated. It was an extremely difficult time. And working across the hospital, my experience is that people have a really serious case of just wanting to forget about it because it was so difficult. And we really don't have rituals or other ways to make sure that it hasn't gone underground and that we don't pay the price in other ways. So I wonder what recommendations you have for us.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we're the helpers, and we were everyone, particularly in hospitals and medical settings, inundated, overloaded with tragic death and loss situations, and had to just keep going, running on overdrive. And after, again, it's over, there were times and there were places where there was praise and there were singing and thank you to healthcare workers, but the long term, where are we now? And are there things that can be done in a medical setting that are looking back to move forward so that it isn't just put it behind you, stuff it down, suck it up, and move forward? Because that's a danger to us. It can lead to depression. It can lead people to avoid situations with their clients because it's just, I can't even go there. It might be that we don't hear something, or we don't respond to something, or we withdraw from patients when they're dying, or we don't help families, that we tough it up. I worked, and I don't just have a minute to say this, worked in a hospital setting where there had been many child deaths in the unit. And, some of them said it's just too much to bear. And I just find I can't turn it off when I go home. And you can ask for help if you go to the director, and you can maybe get a time off on your own or go to a chapel, or you could maybe meet with a chaplain. But what do we have? We talked about it being that we grieve, that it's healing in grief to be able to share our experience, and particularly in a healthcare system, you've all had those experiences. We've all had them. How do we talk about them together? Maybe have a ritual at the end of a year in commemoration, in honoring, in talking about lives that of those that we've worked with, of families, of stories, and of remembering their light, their resilience. There's a study of vicarious resilience that's been done that showed that when we turn to the patients and the families, not only the grief and the loss, but also the courage they had, their endurance. And we think about that. But we also have to nourish our own resilience. We have to not just process the grief, but there has to be a way that we share our experience of in the fullness of the experience. And think about ways in your discipline and your team that can be done. Because it's too much that everybody else says, put it behind you. We're over the pandemic.
Thanks. There's one more question that came in online from Dr. Kehoe, so maybe a quick answer. Can you speak to anticipatory grief within a family system, challenges, things to consider? For example, a person with a terminal cancer diagnosis and supporting the family to manage that anticipatory grief.
Yeah, about terminal cancer. I was going to read a passage from Kalanithi. He wrote this amazing book called When Breath Becomes
Air.
Thank you. And how do you live with a condition that it goes from maybe it's possible that will shorten or limit your life, to now it's more probable, to now it's more certain. And Kalanithi writes about, how do I know for myself? I'm a 38-year-old neurosurgeon. All the research that's been done tells me the averages of how long I can expect. I don't know what to do. Should I write a book? Should I change my career? Should I stay home with my family? That there's so much uncertainty with terminal illnesses that we have to help families talk about making the most of precious time while living with uncertainty. Kalanithi talks about holding a measure of hope in the face of uncertainty. And at the same time, when it becomes probable, it's hard to say the death word, but we need to help people plan for death. Whether we say plan for the end of life, we call them end of life challenges if they don't like the sound of death. But there needs to be discussion on your last wishes. How many of you have your last wishes? How many of you have a will? My daughter, because she's young, but she's in humanitarian work in all parts of the world. Everybody she gave us hers, and we had to look at each other and think, yeah, maybe we should do ours too. Because too often on the other side, what the survivors say is, please don't leave a mess. Tell us what you want for yourself. Tell us what you want for us. Have these conversations. And it can be precious time where I don't know if we'll have another chance together. So I want to make the most of this time. I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to postpone. I remember one man said to me, my brother sent me a text or email from California, and he didn't have long to live. And I meant to go out and see him, but it didn't get to the top of my list. And then the remorse afterward. So that there are things that we can do if we just see this as making the most of precious time.
Thank you so much, Froma. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your important thoughts with us. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.